Hello and welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, we'll continue with the discussion we have started in part one of the migration of the Battleship game project from the traditional 3D application development over to the new Unity VR template. So let's go ahead and jump into it and start the discussion. See you guys in Unity. All right, so for those who are just joining us or are the first time that's visiting this particular channel, last year, the last few weeks of last year, 2024, we started building a game called Battleship. And basically, what I want to do is show you guys that particular game. And I encourage you guys to go ahead and watch those videos if you haven't done so already to get familiar with it and also learn how to actually go step by step by building a game called Battleship using Unity and some of the very important fundamental concepts that you would need to know and learn if you do want to create any 3D applications, again, utilizing Unity 3D as the primary game engine. So this is a quick overview. I just want to give you guys an overview of what we had and how we are going to take this and port it over to the new VR template that's provided here from Unity 6 as well. So let me go ahead and quickly click on play. Okay, so here quickly you can see that we have a pretty simple, clean interface where the user sees and visualizes their board. You have the option of selecting your board pieces from here. Those are all of the different ship types that you can place onto the board, and also the orientation. So if you click on the orientation, you select a particular board, you should be able to visualize how that particular piece is going to be placed onto the board. And once you select it, it's going to go ahead and place it onto the board just like that. So let me go ahead and quickly put this here, and the game will start. And as the game starts, if you're familiar with this particular board game, it is that it's turn-based, and you, as the user, needs to select specific coordinates on your opponent's board. And if there is a hit, then obviously we have a hit. And then if we have a miss, the enemy, the opponent, is going to take their chance and try to hit your board, your particular board. And if they have a hit, they will continue with a hit until they miss, and then it'll come back to you. All right, so this is the game. If you haven't had the opportunity to check it out, again, I encourage you guys to go back and see all of those previous video. And the source code to this particular code is available to you through Patreon. So you do need to actually download the source code because we're going to utilize the same source code that we have developed here in this particular project. And we are migrating it over to the VR template and integrating it into that new paradigm. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and we're going to switch over to the new project and we'll continue from there. Actually, before we actually move to the new project, let's actually understand what's going on here. Quickly an overview, and then we'll go over to the new project and we'll continue over there. So if you take a look at the hierarchy over here, we have a UI manager. The UI manager is in charge of being able to control all of the events and also displaying all of the information back to the user through that particular class. We have the shipyard. The shipyard is using factory uh, the factory builder pattern to basically construct and build and instantiate the different types of ships that you're placing in there. So we talked about a particular design pattern, which happens to be the factory build pattern. And then we have also what's called the board manager. And the board manager is basically going to be in charge of constructing the player's board and also the opponent's board, and also being in charge of determining what's happening on those particular board states. And there's one more particular class that we should be interested in. I'm going to go ahead and click on stop over here, and that would be the game manager, which is basically controlling the primary states of this particular game. So we are going to see how the same concepts are going to be transforming or translating into that VR template. Now we can go ahead and go to that VR project. Okay, so now we are in our new environment. And before we continue on, make sure that you have watched part one of this particular series. In part one, we discussed how to uh, install Unity. If you haven't installed Unity by now, I'm assuming you already have, how to create a VR core template project, and how to get the actual source code that's going to be used and modified for this particular part. So if you haven't done that, go ahead and take a look at part one, and then come back to this video where I'm going to make the explanations and walk you guys through some of the coding adjustments that we have done. Okay, so first things first, I'm not going to spend time as far as the basics. The basics being what? The basics are like how to place your different 3D objects into a particular space. You should be familiar with that already. Again, this is not like a basic tutorial. If you do need to learn how to do those basic stuff, go all the way back to the first episode that I released on this particular channel and watch the first few episodes, and you'll be up and running as far as the super basics, how creating a game object, what a transform is, what are some of the geometric transformations that you can do on it, what scaling is, what positioning is, what rotation is, and all of those basic stuff. I'm not going to be covering those things over here. So if you are at that particular step, this video is going to be a little more intense. So go ahead and watch those videos and then come back here. Okay. All right. So here what we are doing is that we are placing the same pieces, remember, from the other project that we have seen. So a user needs to be able to basically select their board pieces, right? So we have a nice deck over here where they would be able to go ahead and select the actual board piece. And once they select the board piece, they will be able to put it onto their board. We have a much more simplified UI over here where basically they would just be able to click on change of the orientation. And then, of course, we have the scoreboard over here as well. When the game starts, they can start taking note of their actual score. On this other side, these are two new interfaces that we basically have taken from the VR template. One of them is being this video playback. So this is just going to be playing back a video for us. In this particular case, the video was generated using OpenAI in the theme of Battleship. So that video is going to be playing here. And on this side, this is kind of like an onboarding wizard where, again, we have modified the actual content of this particular wizard. And this is, again, provided to you through the VR template. So you can just take that and update the actual content. So over here, we talk about what we have an upcoming message. And then the user will be progressed through like a series of cards where um, they would be becoming familiar with the control systems and what to do, basically how to trigger, how to use the trigger, and how to use the grab to be able to interact with the game objects. So this is the design type. Everything else is pretty much the same. So I have created an empty game object here called Battleship. Under Battleship, we have our board manager, still intact. So under board manager, we have our players board and we have our AI board. So both of them still intact as far as the code is concerned. So we are not doing anything crazy over there. The only difference is that this particular board manager's transform has been modified and scaled, right? Because the scales are different. You got to pay attention to your scales. They have been modified and the scales to fit this particular VR environment. So if I go ahead and click on play right now, this is basically what the user will see once they start the actual simulation. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this right here, get back into the design view. just to let you guys know, for whatever reason, whenever there is Unity doesn't play nice with Zoom, and most of this recording screen captures are done through Zoom. So whenever Zoom is running and we are doing an actual simulation in Unity, the performance within Unity as far as when it's capturing Zoom, as far as it's capturing the playback is not going to be the same as what we see in real time, which is very nice and smooth. During the actual recording of the screen, you might have a lot of lag, just the way the software is capturing the frame rates. So if you guys know how to fix that, do let me know. I haven't figured out a way of doing that. Okay, so let's go back here. So now you see that the boards have been generated. These boards are generated um, through the board manager, and the board manager calls the player board controller and the AI board controller, and they basically create the board. Next is basically we have our input system, and our input system is basically the controllers that you see. And by default, all of these keys have been already mapped to specific controller buttons. So we are going to be utilizing the grab to grab objects. And we are going to use the trigger, which is the UI press over here. So we have tooltips also associated with the actual button types. And those two will be the primary ways that we are going to be interacting with the UI components and also with the actual interactables in the scene. The interactables here are going to be the actual board pieces that you see over here, the ship models. So we can select the ship models and also each one of these board units that are going to be their own prefabs. Okay, so let's take a look and see what are the important components that you need to associate with these objects for them to be able to be interactable. Okay, so let's go ahead and select one of them. So I'm going to select the first one. And this is the first board model over here. Again, we are not going to discuss how to utilize how the positioning, rotation, and the scaling factors are. You need to take those into consideration. Of course, you'll have to do that based on your own design. But more importantly, we are going to discuss the components that you need to associate with any of these game objects that you want to eventually turn them into an interactable, right? So the first thing we are doing is that we are providing a box collider here. So in this particular case, again, we are not going to be making any complicated interactions with this particular model. So just a basic box collider should be enough. And the box collider is required for any of the XR interactable components, right? So by default, if you want to actually be able to move the object in space, you might want to enable the XR grab interactable and the XR general grab transformer. That's basically following, once you start grabbing a particular object, then you can actually follow, right? The object can follow wherever your controller is going. In this particular case, we are not going to be utilizing them. We are going to be utilizing the XR simple interactable. So this is a simple interactable component where basically what we are going to do is just have it detect if the ray casting, the ray from this particular controllers are kind of going over the object. That's called hovering, right? It's kind of like your mouse is hovering over any of these UI components over here. That's a hover, right? So generally speaking, if you're going over any UI component, you see a slight little tooltip, or you get like a highlight or something like that, right? So in this particular case, our hovers are going to enable and disable a visual clue that's showing that, okay, we are actually pointing to it. And that visual clue is going to be done through this particular sphere, green sphere. So this green sphere will either enable or disable, kind of giving a signal back to the user as far as, okay, you're something, you can interact with this particular object or you're hovering on this object. To actually build the trigger for that, you can go ahead, if you come down to the interactable events on the XR simple interactable, and all of the interactable do implement some sort of interactable event. So you just have to, the same concept applies to any one of these guys. So we'll come down to the hover, and over here we are going to register two of the events. One of them is on hover entered, and one of them is on hover exited. And basically what's going to happen is that we are going to, in this case, directly enable or disable the game object, right? So we are enabling or disabling the game object. So we are not even utilizing any C# code to do that. We are directly manipulating this by referencing that particular game object. And then we can access the game object's public attributes. And in this particular case, we are accessing the game object's set active function, and we are either enabling it or disabling it. Okay, so that's number one. Number two is basically being able to select this particular object. Now, in order for us to be able to select this particular object, we do register two events over here. So on select, the first one is going to call the UI manager, and it's going to call the specific function over here. We can take a look at what that function is. It's called beauty board place selected, and we are passing up a unique integer. This integer is the index of the ship, where we have a dictionary set up that basically tells the index number and some of the other properties that go along with this particular piece that you're going to be interacting with. And the second thing that happens is that we are again setting the visualization of the object, the second one now, to true as well. Okay, so now we have enabled, so we have selected the object. It's no longer like a transparent hover visualization. We have actually selected that object. Okay. And that's basically what it is. So all of these other ships have similar setup. We have the XR simple interactable, and over there we have on hover entered and on hover exited basically enabled to basically display or hide particular visual. In this case, it's just a simple sphere with a green material associated with it. And then of course we have the actual selection method where we now can jump into the UI manager and bring up the source code. Let's wait for this to come up. And what I did is that I kept the old code for you to also see, and then we are going to take a look at the new code that was adopted or added to take into consideration for our VR template. Okay, so in this particular case, what we are doing is we are calling the same exact method, beauty board piece selected, and we're passing in the ship ID. So nothing has changed here from that respect. And we are just making sure that our dictionary contains that particular ID. And if it does, then we go ahead and raise a custom event on change the ship. So this tells the whoever's listening to this that the player has selected a different piece. So go ahead and update the visuals accordingly. And then if that particular ship ID is not registered, then obviously we are going to provide them with some sort of a warning or an error. Okay, so let's go ahead and follow this on change ships. So let's take a look at all of the references. And we see that the board manager is subscribed to it. So let's go down here. What's happening is that we are just updating the current ship ID and the ship size, and that's all we need to do. In the update function, what's happening is that while the count of ships are less than 5 as far as placing them on the board, then don't do anything at this point. We used to have place player pieces onto the board, but now we don't need that particular code because the whole UI UX has changed. What's going to happen is that we are going to be waiting on hover player piece VR. So this is one new additional function that has been incorporated here. And basically what we are going to be doing is that we are going to see which board unit the user is hovering over. And based on that, we are going to visualize the actual placement of the ship. So let's go back to the Unity. And let's go back to our simulation. Let's move forward. And this is the hover piece right here. So as the controller's ray is hovering from one piece to the next, you see that we are visualizing it. And then we are going to press G to simulate the grab key. And now we are hovering over to the board unit. And as we are hovering over to the board unit, depending on the board unit, it's going to take that into consideration. And then depending on the orientation of the ship, it's going to visualize how that particular ship is going to be placed and which board units it's going to occupy. Right. So if I go ahead and change the orientation, now you see that the orientation has changed. If I go ahead and change the orientation again, and let's go ahead and select this particular board unit as where we want to place that particular ship. I go ahead and click on G. And what it does is that it goes ahead and places that particular ship onto the board based on the location we decided and its orientation. And then it's deactivating the actual ship from the palette so that you can't modify it, you can't change it any longer, right? So let's take a look at and see how that particular piece can be done. So let's pause this over here. And now let's switch over to our board unit. So our board unit prefab, similarly, we had to add the XR simple interactable to it. And basically, we also had to enable the hover entered and the hover exited um, triggers, right? Events. And this basically what it does is that it's going to call the board unit class, and that is going to basically change the material of this plate to whatever color indicating a hover. In this particular case, that happens to be orange looking material. And then if we do select it, of course, we are going to go ahead and now try to place the piece that we have selected onto the board using that particular board unit if there are no collisions with any other um, board units that have been already occupied. Okay, so let's take a look at that first. So over here, we have, so the first thing is that we are adding one more component to our board unit that we didn't have before. That happens to be the XR simple interactable, right? So in the XR simple intractable, we are just checking to see if you are hovering over that board unit or not. That basically determines the color that you see as we like move our controllers. It keeps on highlighting those particular units, so you know actually which one you're pointing to, right? So it's a nice visual feedback. And then the second important thing is that, okay, now go ahead and select this particular board unit. So when you select it, obviously we do the logic behind that. Okay, so let's go ahead and see, let's see. Yep, that's pretty much it. So now let's go ahead and see the changes that we have done on our board unit class.
All right, guys, so let's take a quick look at the board unit and some of the changes that we have done in the board unit to make it compatible with the VR controllers. So let's start from the top. So we have added 3 new events. One of them is board unit hover, the other one is place board piece, and the other one is player hat hit. So we are adding these events to the board unit because majority of the interaction and the input that we are going to be doing as far as the VR is concerned is going to be through the board unit and how the controllers are going to be interacting with the board unit. So the board unit hover is going to be called anytime we are hovering over the board, and this will basically send a signal to the board manager where the board manager will consume this. And when it's consuming it, it's going to basically go ahead and determine the actual location of the board unit and how to place that board unit the onto the board itself, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at it. So here, this function inside board manager is the delegate function that's going to handle whenever we raise that event. And basically what we are doing is that we are calling the hover player piece VR function, where basically we are passing in the board unit and whether we are going to be placing the object or not. So in this case, what we are doing is that we are just checking to see which row and column that particular board unit happens to be in, because we have the data stored in a two-dimensional array as far as the player board is concerned. And we basically execute the same logic. So the logic is the same, right? So the logic of how to detect whether a particular board unit has been occupied or is not occupied and what to do from a visualization perspective is the same. The biggest change is how you're going to be handling that, right? So previously in the other traditional 3D application, we've been doing this using the mouse, and then the mouse was basically driving everything. And as far as the mouse was concerned, if it was hovering over any of the boards through a raycasting, we no longer do the raycasting. The raycasting is actually done through the hovering over to the board unit, and therefore we have this, right? So we are handling the hover of the board unit, and at particular time, whenever we are hovering over to the board unit, this particular event is being raised, passing in the board unit itself back to the board manager, where the board manager then determines whether, depending on the size of the ship that we have selected and the orientation of the ship, it basically goes through that logic that we have built to determine if you can place that particular piece onto the board or not. Okay, so this is what basically is handling that particular execution logic. So we go through this, right? Again, if it's occupied, if it's not occupied, if it's occupied, we have a yellow signal for the warning. And if it's not occupied, we have the grid visual feedback that, okay, it's okay for you to place it. And this happens whether you're on the vertical orientation or the horizontal orientation. When that does happen, so this basically is just a raycasting, right? So nothing has been actually placed onto the board. Assuming that you are okay to place, and we have a flag over here that we are saying, okay, you are okay to place. If you're okay to place, going back to the board unit, there's another event that we are saying, okay, now go ahead and place it, right? So let's say we have visualized that we are okay to place that piece onto the board, and now we want to actually place it onto the board. There's another function that actually is handling the grab technique, right? And we'll take a look at those functions. When we are doing a grab, and if we happen to be in the particular state of placing the board pieces, then we are going to, again, go ahead and erase this event, pass in the board unit one more time, and we are going to tell it whether we want to place the board officially onto the place the piece officially onto the board or not. And that's basically what this other event does. And in the board manager, once we handle it at the top in the enable disable functions, when we register the actual events, this particular function now is going to handle the actual placement of the board piece onto the board, of the ship onto the board. Again, it's the same logic that we had previously. It's just being handled differently, right? And instead of having a mouse input interaction, now we have the controller's input interaction, but the logic is the same. There is one caveat over here. So once we go through and make sure that we capture and we record everything and we put it back into the actual data structure that's holding the board data, what we are doing is that we are also going to place the new model instantiation over to that particular board unit. So over here, again, we have a similar function where we switch the keys based on the ship ID. We already have the board unit that we are going to be utilizing um, to instantiate the initial position. And the rest is pretty much the same, right? We are utilizing that factory builder pattern to instantiate the actual ship builder, right? With the ship type. And then we are determining where exactly we want to place that particular position and what type of orientation it should be on based on if it's a vertical or horizontal. And then finally, we call the construct function on the shipyard. We pass in the builder, we pass in the ship ID, the position, rotation, and in this particular case, we have updated the construct on the shipyard to also take a transform for the parent because we want to assign it and associate it onto the actual board unit, so it's going to be nicely evenly aligned when it comes to actually placing that board onto the board. So let's go ahead and switch back over to Unity, and let me go ahead and click on Run. Obviously, again, as I discussed, when Zoom is running and when we are executing Unity, there might be some delays. In this case, the delay was not there. So what we have just been talking about is the following. So once we select the particular ship type and we come over here and we are doing a hover over to the board, this is that hover event, right? So the hover event gets triggered. Then the board manager determines if first of all, it knows your ship ID, and it knows your size, and it knows your orientation, right? So based on those three values, it goes ahead and visualizes how the ship is going to be laid onto the board. So here's the horizontal aspect, and here's the vertical aspect. And as soon as I click G is the grab button, then the other piece event gets raised, and that second function on the board manager gets executed, where it actually instantiates the model based on the ship type and based on which board unit we were on, and then it computes the actual positioning and the rotation according to the board unit, and then finally it places it onto the board. Okay, so it's pretty nice and straightforward. In fact, majority of the code, over 90% of the code has been reused from our previous design and implementation. The only changes that we have done from a coding perspective is that we have shifted the logic of the input handling over to the board unit from the actual player board controller and the enemy board controller. This was the fastest way of doing it. I wanted to quickly do this for you guys. So each board unit now is going to be responsible as far as how it's going to interact with the rest of the game logic. So if we scroll down here, in the update function, we are either starting the game or not. If you haven't started the game, then go ahead and return. No need to execute any one of these things. The VR grab is the function that is being called. Again, if you haven't started the game, go ahead and call this event. We actually want to place the ship onto the board. If the game has been started, then we are not going to be doing that anymore. It's going to be whether we have a hit on the enemy's board or not, right? Don't forget that board unit is both used for the player and also for the enemy, right? So you got to be cautious on that, right? So you got to determine whose turn it is when you're doing the grab, and depending on the state of the game, if you're going to be interacting with the enemy's board or are you going to be interacting with the player's board. In this case, if you're interacting with the player's board, we are just going to invoke the onPlace board piece event, where basically we pass in the board unit and we tell it to go ahead and place this if everything's fine. And that gets handled by the board manager. It determines if it's fine or not. So if it's fine, it places the board piece onto the board. And if it's not fine, then nothing happens. But if the game has been started and we are actually utilizing the grab to interact with the enemy's board now, then we compute a different thing. We determine to see if that particular board unit that you're trying to attack is occupied or not, and if it's hit or not, right? So if it's occupied and if it hasn't been hit before, then we hit it, and then we invoke the player had hit, and we increase the score for the enemy. I'm sorry, for the player, right? So we have the hit and go ahead and give us a point, or we could have a miss, right? So it wasn't occupied, and regardless if you have a hit or not, it wasn't occupied. Therefore, go ahead and say that there was no hit, and we get a score of 0. We did add a new um, field attribute called observe. And this is important because we want to know if that particular board unit was observed or not, meaning that if you have interacted with it or not. And if you have been interacting with it, we want to keep track of that too, because we want to visualize that on the graphics side. All right, so this is the VR grab, where it handles all of your grab interactions. And over here, we have the unit board hover function that's being called, and depending on the state of the game, if you are started or not, and then whether you're the enemy board or non-enemy board, and if you're occupied or not occupied, basically what it does, it changes the materials for the visuals, and also it invokes the event onboard unit hover event, passes the board unit, where the board manager then again takes over and basically visualizes the placement of the particular ship type onto the board while you're interacting with it, right? So both of this are additions that we have done. So this is new code that's been added to the board unit. By the way, all of this will be available for you guys to download on Patreon, right? So again, make sure that you go to the Patreon site, become a member. Membership is free. Once you become a member, then you would have access to download the actual source code as a Unity package. It's going to include everything. You're going to get everything. So you're going to get all of the scenes, all of the assets, and obviously all of the code and everything that you need to be able to study it. So that's pretty much it. I mean, those are the biggest changes. The biggest changes have been on the board manager, where we are handling these new events that are coming from the board unit, and the board unit is now the glue, the primary class where all of the interactions we are doing with the board unit happens, and everyone else is listening to that and performing their own duties. In fact, it has simplified the code to some extent. So hopefully this was good. And yeah, so don't forget to check it out and download it from the Patreon site, and talk to you guys soon. All right, guys, thank you for stopping by again. So this was kind of a long one, but there was quite a bit of things to cover. Again, I didn't get too much into the depth of it, but all of the source code is available. All of the assets are available. If you go ahead and become a member on the Patreon page, on the free tier membership, you would have access to not just the original code with the traditional desktop application for the Battleship with the train design and the water shaders and all of those. But you would also get an opportunity to download the VR version of it as well as a Unity package. And all you need to do is import it into your Unity project, and you should be able to build it and go from there. All right. Thank you very much for stopping by. Don't forget to like and subscribe. More content will be coming your way pretty soon. Have a good one. Bye bye.